She was washing dishes to pay tuition, until a trust fund was activated on her 21st, which made her inherit $100 million. This might be the best story you'll hear today. Welcome back, and enjoy the story. The fluorescent light above flickered, erratically casting harsh shadows across the cramped kitchen of Murphy's Diner in downtown Chicago. Steam rose from scalding dishwater as Margaret's raw red hands plunged another grease-stained plate into the murky depths. Her fingers, once soft and delicate, now bore the calluses of countless hours, scrubbing away the remnants of other people's meals. The industrial clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and her worn sneakers squelched against the perpetually damp floor. At 20 years old, Margaret juggled 3 jobs just to afford her final semester of education, while her university classmates posted photos of spring break trips to Cancun and brand new cars their parents had gifted them. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, but she held on to one unwavering truth she wanted to teach: to transform young lives, to make a difference in a world that seemed determined to keep her down. Margaret had met David at a campus coffee shop 6 months earlier, where his confident smile and designer clothes immediately set him apart from her usual circle of struggling students. He was everything she wasn't: polished, wealthy, effortlessly charming. His family, the prestigious Hawthornes, owned real estate developments across Illinois, hosted elaborate charity galas, and moved through Chicago's elite social circles with practiced ease. When David first invited her to dinner at his parents' Lakeshore Drive mansion, Margaret spent her last $40 on a modest black dress from a thrift store, pressing it carefully in her tiny studio apartment and rehearsing conversation topics in the mirror. But the moment she stepped into their marble-floored foyer, adorned with crystal chandeliers and oil paintings, worth more than her yearly income, she felt the crushing weight of inadequacy settle over her like a suffocating fog. The dinner unfolded, like a carefully orchestrated performance designed to highlight her unworthiness. David's mother, Patricia, surveyed Margaret with the clinical detachment of an art appraiser examining a questionable piece. "So, dear," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "David tells us you work in food service to fund your education. How industrious of you." Her father, Richard, barely acknowledged Margaret's presence, occasionally glancing up from his phone to offer dismissive comments about the unrealistic expectations of public school teachers. When Margaret attempted to explain her passion for helping underprivileged children, Patricia interrupted with a patronizing smile. "How noble, though I do wonder about the financial wisdom of such career choices." David remained silent throughout, the evening occasionally nodding at his parents' pointed remarks, his earlier warmth replaced by an uncomfortable distance that made Margaret's heart sink. As weeks turned into months, Margaret found herself walking on eggshells, constantly second-guessing her words and actions. David began echoing his parents' condescending tone, critiquing her clothes, her mannerisms, her dreams. "You need to understand," he would say after particularly brutal family dinners, "my parents are just protective. They want what's best for me." But Margaret knew the truth. They saw her as a threat to their carefully constructed world, a reminder of the life they'd worked so hard to escape. The late-night shifts at the diner became her refuge, where the honest sweat of hard work felt more authentic than the suffocating pretense of David's social circle. Her co-workers Maria and Tom treated her with genuine respect, sharing stories and dreams without judgment or calculation. Yet each morning she returned to David's world, hoping that love might somehow bridge the impossible gap between their realities. The engagement happened suddenly, almost clinically. David proposed during a family dinner, producing a ring his mother had clearly selected. Before Margaret could fully process the moment, Patricia slid a thick manila envelope across the mahogany table. "Just a formality, dear," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We protect our family's interests." The prenuptial agreement was thorough and merciless, stripping Margaret of any claim to David's inheritance, property, or assets. "I've never asked for anything from your family," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Richard finally looked directly at her, his expression cold and calculating. We simply want to ensure our son isn't taken advantage of by someone with limited financial resources." The words hung in the air like poison, and Margaret turned to David, desperately seeking support, understanding anything. But he stared at his untouched dessert, mumbling, "It's just paperwork, Margaret, don't overthink it." And in that moment of profound loneliness, surrounded by people who should have become her family, Margaret signed away her future, believing that love would somehow be enough. The question that would haunt her for months was whether she was protecting their relationship or surrendering her dignity. And the answer would prove more devastating than she could have imagined. Their wedding was a small, sterile affair held in the Hawthorns' private garden. Patricia dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though Margaret suspected the tears were more about the social implications than joy. Richard delivered a toast. That sounded more like a business merger announcement than a celebration of love. Margaret's own family couldn't afford the trip from their small town in Indiana, leaving her isolated among strangers who viewed her as an interloper rather than a new family member. The marriage began with tentative hope, but cracks appeared quickly. David insisted they live in his apartment, sleep in his bed, socialize with his friends. Margaret continued working her multiple jobs, contributing to household expenses, while David made increasingly cutting remarks about her humble origins. "You're embarrassing me," became his favorite phrase uttered whenever she used public transportation, wore clothes from discount stores, or expressed opinions that didn't align with his family's conservative worldview. The woman who had once dreamed of changing the world through education now found herself shrinking daily, her voice growing smaller, her confidence eroding like sand in an hourglass. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, or known someone who has experienced this kind of emotional diminishment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The breaking point came during a family dinner where Patricia announced plans to redecorate their apartment. "Margaret, dear," she said, gesturing dismissively at the modest furnishings, "these pieces are so quaint. We'll arrange for proper furniture befitting David's position." Margaret watched in stunned silence as they discussed her living space as if she were a tenant rather than a wife. That night, alone in the bathroom, she stared at her reflection and barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman looking back. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Margaret, honey, never let anyone convince you that you're less than you are. Your worth isn't determined by their acceptance." The elderly woman had been quiet, almost invisible in their small family, but her wisdom had always been a source of comfort. Margaret had written to her grandmother regularly during her struggles, sharing her dreams and fears, though the responses had become increasingly rare as her health declined. What Margaret didn't know was that her grandmother had been watching, planning and preparing for this exact moment when her granddaughter would need rescuing most. On Margaret's 21st birthday, a registered letter arrived at their apartment. David was at work, and Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she opened the official document. Her grandmother had established a trust fund years earlier, sealed until Margaret came of age, worth $100 million. Margaret read the numbers again and again, certain she was hallucinating from exhaustion. The accompanying letter, written in her grandmother's familiar handwriting, explained everything. "My dear Margaret, I've watched you struggle with grace and dignity. This money isn't just inheritance, it's insurance against those who would try to diminish your light. Use it wisely, but more importantly, use it to remember who you truly are." Margaret sat in stunned silence, not with joy, but with a profound sense of awakening. For the first time in months, she felt the stirring of something she'd almost forgotten: power. She carefully placed the documents in a safe deposit box she opened that afternoon, telling no one about her newfound wealth. Instead, she decided to watch and wait, curious to see how knowledge of money might change the people who had treated her as worthless. The transformation was swift and nauseating. Within days of the trust fund's existence becoming known through legal channels, David's behavior shifted dramatically. He brought home flowers, expensive wine, and suddenly wanted to hear about her day. Patricia called her darling and invited her to exclusive shopping trips. Richard discussed investment opportunities and business ventures with newfound respect. "Perhaps you can finally leave those service positions," Patricia suggested during a family dinner, her voice dripping with false concern. "Now that you have Options. Margaret smiled and nodded, playing the role of grateful daughter-in-law, while internally cataloguing every hypocritical word. She hired a private attorney to review her prenuptial agreement and was surprised to discover that while it protected David's assets, it said nothing about wealth she might acquire independently. Her money was entirely her own, beyond their reach and influence. For weeks she played along with their sudden affection, watching them plan elaborate renovations for an apartment she was already planning to leave, listening to their schemes to integrate her inheritance into their family's investment portfolio. The discovery of David's infidelity came by accident, but felt like destiny. His phone, left carelessly on the counter while he showered, buzzed with a message from someone named Jessica. "Can't wait for tonight. You're everything she's not. Sophisticated, worthy of your family's name." Margaret's hands remained steady as she scrolled through months of messages, photos, and evidence of a relationship that had apparently been ongoing since before their wedding. The conversations revealed not just adultery, but cruel mockery of Margaret's background, her appearance, her dreams. David and Jessica laughed about her pathetic jobs, her delusional teaching aspirations, her inability to know her place. But instead of tears, Margaret felt something else entirely, a cold, crystalline clarity. She hired a private investigator that same day, instructing them to document everything. For the first time since her marriage, Margaret felt truly alive, her mind sharp and focused on a single objective: freedom. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday evening, when David returned home smug and slightly drunk from what he claimed was a business dinner. "I've been thinking," he announced, loosening his tie, "we should invest part of your inheritance in Dad's new development project. Keep the money in the family, you know." Margaret slid a manila folder across their dining table, her expression calm and unreadable. "What's this?" David asked, his confident smile beginning to falter. "Read it," she replied simply. The folder contained divorce papers, photographic evidence of his affair, financial records, and a copy of their prenuptial agreement with specific clauses highlighted in yellow. David's face drained of color as he processed the documents. "You can't touch my inheritance," he stammered, his voice cracking. "The prenup protects everything." Margaret pointed to a specific paragraph she'd memorized. "This agreement protects assets belonging to David Hawthorne and makes no claim to assets acquired independently by Margaret Hawthorne during the marriage." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and for the first time in their relationship, David was speechless. "You protected your family's wealth," Margaret said, her voice steady and strong, "but you forgot to protect yourself from mine." The Hawthorne family's reaction was swift and vicious. Patricia called screaming threats, Richard demanded meetings with lawyers, and David pleaded alternately with desperation and rage. But Margaret had prepared thoroughly. Her attorney had uncovered years of financial irregularities in the Hawthorne businesses, hidden assets, tax evasion, fraudulent claims that painted a picture of systematic deception. When they contested the divorce in court, Margaret arrived with forensic accountants, private investigators, and evidence that transformed a simple dissolution of marriage into a criminal investigation. The judge, a stern woman named Helen Morrison, reviewed the documentation with growing concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension, "these financial irregularities constitute criminal fraud. I'm referring this matter to the state attorney's office." David's face went white as he realized his name was attached to numerous questionable transactions, regardless of his actual knowledge or involvement. The family's prestigious reputation crumbled like a house of cards in a windstorm, their society, connections evaporating as quickly as their hidden assets were seized by federal investigators. Margaret walked away from the courthouse with her head held high, wealthy beyond measure, but richer still in self-respect. The prenup that was meant to trap her had instead become her liberation, protecting her inheritance while exposing their corruption. She established a foundation dedicated to helping first-generation college students, paid off student loans for dozens of aspiring teachers, and finally opened the community learning center she'd dreamed about during those endless nights washing dishes. The Hawthornes lost everything: their estate, their business, their standing in Chicago society. David's last text to Margaret was a desperate plea for financial help, which she deleted without response. From her new home overlooking Lake Michigan, Margaret often stood at her window watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and possibility. The woman who had once felt invisible now understood that her worth had never been determined by their acceptance or rejection. She had simply been waiting for the moment when she would remember her own strength and step fully into the light of her destiny. The most powerful transformation isn't revenge. It's becoming exactly who you were meant to be despite those who said it was impossible. Margaret's journey from the fluorescent-lit kitchen of Murphy's Diner to the sunlit halls of her own educational foundation proved that sometimes the greatest gift isn't what people give you, but what their rejection teaches you about your own. Resilience. In helping others achieve their dreams, she discovered that her grandmother's true inheritance wasn't money. It was the unwavering belief that every person deserves respect, opportunity, and the chance to rise above the limitations others try to impose. The seeds of change she planted in young minds would grow far beyond what any trust fund could purchase, creating a legacy measured not in dollars, but in transformed lives and realized dreams. Congratulations, Type 7 in the comments, so I know. You stayed with me until the end. Leave a like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. See you.